This is Bible School Radio, KDKR, Decatur, Dallas, Fort Worth, KYJC, Commerce, and KMWC, Bethany. On the web at kdkr.org and on all your devices with the Live 365 app. Portions of KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, Washington and student loans, trying to make sense of it all. Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thanks so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, what kind of shape is the student loan program in since we last checked? Is this transition getting messier, or is there, for once, good communications occurring? College admissions expert John Upalo is here to weigh in. Hey, John, how's it going today?
I'm doing great, Bob. How are you?
Besides stumbling over my words and not being able to get them out of my mouth, not too bad. Must be Monday.
Well, I'm glad. Yeah, it's not actually unreasonable that you're stumbling over your words, because we've been talking about some of the very same issues for many years now. So I hope that we can do more than sort of stumble along and actually find some answers that will help some of your listeners deal with this.
You know, and that's one of the concerns that I have about all these changes with student loans is that, a family, as you know, and you see all the time, families are dependent upon student loans and the ability to get them. And then you wake up one day and go, that's not an option now, or that's a very limited option. Where can people get information to really understand and know what is they have something to cover these costs?
Yeah, Bob, that's a great question. I love the way you frame that, too, because the answer all the time when we're talking about what's right for a family is it depends. But what is not the same answer for all the families is that it no longer depends on how much of the student aid you're going to be able to get. So the very first step along this whole process for families who are trying to figure this out is to fill out that FAFSA form. And that's going to become available on October 1 this year. 2 years ago, you and I were talking about the FAFSA fiasco, and they fixed it. So now we've got a process in place that seems to be going reasonably well for just about everybody who's gotten into it. It went much better last year than the year before. The testing for the groups this year say that it's even that much better. If your listeners go to mycollegecorner.com, they can get a little preview of this. So the FAFSA form is required for any federal aid at all. So a loan, work study, the Pell Grants, other grants. So this is a really important form that folks can fill out. If they go to mycollegecorner.com, our financial aid calculator there has already been updated to give the new answers based on the formula that the Department of Education uses to determine how much aid a student might be eligible for. So you ought to go up there and kind of check that out, get a little bit of a preview to see what their eligibility will be. And that's just for financial aid in general. The good news is for this year's high school seniors who fill out that FAFSA form, they're going to be eligible for the same amount of student loans that they were before. And now I'm talking about undergraduates. Well, we can talk about the graduate students in a moment. But for next year's class, and again, this is a class that's going to start literally a year from now, so it's academic year 26-27. But for that class, they're going to be eligible for $5,500 of federal student loans, just like last year's class was. And they have to fill out that FAFSA form just as a way to put their marker down saying that if they need a loan, they'll have an opportunity to get one.
So that hasn't changed?
That hasn't changed at all. That's right.
But really the one thing, the biggest thing that's changed, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Parents Plus loans are not just a slam dunk.
That's right. Now, here again is the caveat. So let's talk about first time. This is a first time high school senior. The parents are getting into this for the first time. The students are doing it for the first time. So those parents are not going to have the same kind of access to the PLUS loan program. And PLUS was an acronym, Parent for Loan for Undergraduate Student, PLUS. And you can go to the Department of Education's website. It's actually quite good. It gives a lot of the details about all of this. But what was helpful in the past was that the PLUS loan program doesn't really have a very stringent credit criteria. So many, in fact, most parents would qualify for it. They could borrow whatever they needed to send the student to whatever school they wanted to go to. That has changed pretty fundamentally. And now for the class that's going to be beginning in 26, 27, parents are only going to be able to borrow up to $20,000 per year per child and have a cap on the total amount they can borrow per student of $65,000. So that's a very significant change for parents of students who are starting. And I caveated all this by saying this is for the new students. The Congress did build in, and then I guess the one big beautiful bill built in basically the grandfathering provision. So if the parents are already in the program and their students need 1 or 2 or 3 more years of school, they're going to be able to borrow under the old provisions, which is basically up to the cost of attendance. So it's different depending on who you are.
So let's go through a couple of examples. So you have the freshman student starting out, let's see, next year.
Next year. Yeah, next
26.
That's right.
August 26th. Are they under the new plan or the old plan?
If they have not been to school before, they're under the new plan. So their parents can only borrow $20,000 for them for school. The student can borrow $5,500 as a freshman, and they are under the old plan. I'm sorry, the new plan. So they're borrowing at the new limits, and the students also will only have 2 options when they get to repayment, but we can talk about that down the line. But for the most part, the loan program for the undergraduate student remain the same. The subsidies, there's a possibility to have the government pay the in-school interest while the student's still in school. There's an unsubsidized program as well, but none of that has changed for first-year freshmen.
You know, it's interesting when they roll out these big changes. They typically give minimum of 2, sometimes 3 to 4 years, so that the individual has a runway to implement. Not really getting that with this.
No, and Bob, I think it's part of the bigger H.R. 1 Big Beautiful Bill philosophy around education. And I'm actually on the Andover Newton Seminary at the Yale Divinity School Advisory Council. And so I'm really close to this at a professional school. And we had a meeting recently, and one of the comments that was made is that this idea of limiting the loan amounts is just one in a bunch of levers that the Big Beautiful Bill took to try to go attack higher education. You know, there's this tax on the endowment. They're fining people. They're killing some of the grant programs. They're trying to take the revenue base that a college might have, particularly those with big foreign students. And so this was the idea of like doing it quickly is just the philosophy of the way this bill came together. There was no question right from the beginning that it was going to happen quickly. And remember, they drew a line in the sand and said, we have to have this done by 4th of July. Right? And most people in March and April were saying, oh, that can't happen. This is going to be 6 months or so. Even the professionals in Washington were saying this. And then they drew a line in the sand and said, no, we're going to sign the bill before the 4th of July, and it's going to happen. So I think that really made the urgency come along like an express train making all this happen.
You know, one item with the one Big Beautiful Bill that I wanted to cover was, and in fact, this is really the first time I came across this, the disallowing student loans on careers that do not meet a earnings threshold. Talk a little bit about what listeners need to know about that.
Yeah, this is another variation of a theme, and the theme is called institutional accountability. So for a long time, and actually on both sides of the aisle, members of Congress have been saying, we're making these loans available for students to go to school, and it's basically allowing the schools to have unchecked access to revenue, right? There's no real check in place. So many, many years ago, they tied a college or let me put it this way, anyone who's eligible for what they call Title IV funding, which is basically the federal grants and all this for education. So any of the loans, the grants and all, they said, okay, if your institution, whatever you are, you might be a truck driving school or you might be an Ivy League school, if your default rate for your students exceeds a certain amount, we're going to put you on probation, and if it continues, we're going to reduce the access or eliminate the access you have to federal student loan programs and all those other programs. So, the schools sort of adjusted, and the for-profit schools particularly had trouble with this, and sometimes like the truck driving schools and some of the other sort of career-related schools had real trouble because their borrowers were exceeding these default rates and the institutions were being closed. And so this has been out there for a long time. So the Congress said this time was, we're going to actually get at it a little bit finer. We're going to say on a school-by-school basis, we want to make sure that the graduate of that school actually had some benefit from paying all that money to get that degree. And so what they came up with this idea that they're going to compare the median earnings for those who complete the 4-year program, they're going to compare that to the earnings of those who are just working adults in the same career. So what they want to see is that the undergraduate who comes out is actually making more money than a high school graduate. So that's kind of how they're getting at it. And this is going to be one of these things, Bob, where it's going to, the way they wrote the law, it says they're going to look at this 4 years after the student graduates. And all these rules go into effect in another, I think this one starts on next July 1 as well. So that means we're not going to see any of this for 5 years, right? Which tells me that it could well be that somebody else is going to get to change the rule down the line again. But the way it stands right now, it's very much in line with the way they're trying to do before. So if we're going to give you school, certificate program, apprentice, whatever it is, if we're going to give you access to federal funds, we want to make sure that people who are going through your program and paying all that money actually get some benefit from it. So at a high level, it's kind of hard to disagree that they're thinking that way. But again, I know the devil can be in the detail here, how they make that happen and, what the metrics are. And for instance, a minister graduating from the Andover Newton Seminary is not going to likely go into a very high-paying job, right? So who are they going to compare that graduate to? So this is going to be a really interesting question. They're getting a great degree, and they're doing great work, God's work, and all the rest of it. But the question is, how are they going to be compared when they start drawing the line in the sand to say, okay, this new graduate of this particular program actually has a benefit? It's going to be very interesting.
Okay, so your thoughts on the lifetime borrowing caps for graduate degrees, professional degrees, where do you stand on that?
Yeah, this is a really tough one. Let me give you the one side of the coin, and then I'll answer your question directly. So you and I have spent a lot of time, and your listeners have heard us talk a lot about student loan defaults and delinquencies and the big problem there is in that area. And by the way, about the data on this is getting worse and worse quarter over quarter. The last metrics that we saw, the last reports for June of 2025, said that there were now like 6 million student loan defaulters, up from 5.3 million just 3 months before that, and 4 more million likely to default in the next 6 months. So there could be, by the end of this year, 10 million defaulters on student loans. The delinquency rates are going through the roof. It's up to 10.2% in June. So that's one side of the coin. You got this really difficult problem with the current borrowers not making the payments, and they're being saddled with this for a long time. So that's the first side of the coin. Now, to answer your question on the other side of the coin, how did the Congress decide, or the negotiators decide, what they can do to try to reduce those default delinquency rates? And one of the things that they saw over time, which I honestly don't disagree with necessarily, is that sometimes the graduate students were the ones who were taking excessive amounts of debt, not getting that job that was actually giving them enough income to make those payments on those loans. And so when they looked at that data, they came to a conclusion and said, well, we're going to cap the amount that graduate students can borrow. And I'll tell you what those cap amounts are, and then I'll sort of give you both sides. But for most graduate programs, they're capping it at $20,500 with an aggregate lifetime cap of $100,000. For professional students, see, these are doctors, lawyers, maybe ministers as well, $50,000 per year with an aggregate cap of $200,000, and then this lifetime borrowing cap that says no matter who you are, what you've done, what you've studied, you cannot in total borrow more than $257,500 from the federal government. So they put all these caps in place. Now it gets I'll tie the ribbon together for you. I told you a little story about our Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School Advisory Council, where they come and say, well, wait a minute, they want to make sure that our graduates are making more than those without a degree. This is the same problem that all the graduate schools are going to have. So they're going to cap the amount that they can borrow so they don't become one of those defaulters on the other side, right? So there's actual logic in place trying to affect one of the programs. But the other part of this discussion, which is where it gets very fuzzy, and I won't give my opinion on this at all, is that many of the schools, particularly the graduate schools, are saying this is really just another hammer because the current administration is at war with academia generally. So this is just another way for them to come and say, we want you to close some programs, we don't want you to be teaching this. And again, I don't have a view of that, but I'm just saying from a logical sort of banking perspective, if you have a default delinquency problem, the way you go back and if you're a banker, is you tighten the credit, which the federal government can't do because they give loans to anybody who needs them. But what they can do is cap the amount that someone can borrow. And when they looked at which programs they were going to cap, they said to the undergraduates, we're going to leave you alone because we think those limits are reasonable and where they could be. And actually, I would make an argument that they should increase them a little bit, but that's a different story. But for the graduate students who are often big defaulters, they said, we're not going to let you get into that kind of trouble. So that's kind of the fact of it. And then the question becomes, okay, and this is where you started the show, and I think it's a great conversation to have, what does this mean for a family that thought today, or let me say this, they thought 6 months ago that their student could go and do something as an undergraduate, maybe their student got out of school and they have a job and now they want to go to a graduate program or something like that. Where does that leave them? Because the game has definitely changed.
Yeah, do you think as well that this points to a lot of graduate students, excuse me, getting a graduate degree for kind of all the wrong reasons?
Well, this is anecdotal, Bob. I don't have any data behind this, but I know when I hear the stories or you read about the graduate students who have hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt and they're serial students, so they have 4 degrees and they're going to go back for one more, and now they're 35 or 40 years old, and you're saying, hey, how about getting a job, right, and start paying this off?
Right.
There's some of that, but again, I think those are outliers. I think most students don't go to any program saying, I want to study a lot, take a big debt so that I can be a defaulter in 3 or 4 years from now. I don't think people think that way. But on the other hand, they also don't plan, and they don't say, okay, if I go and I go to this very expensive school, am I going to get a job that's going to allow me to make the payments? And, sometimes I'm foolishly optimistic about some of this, but I'm hoping that somebody's going to start to think about it in advance and say, okay, I want to go to this school. This is how much financial aid they're offering me. I'm going to look at the other school. Maybe it's not a brand name school. Maybe they don't have a great football program. Maybe all the rest of it doesn't line up. But I can afford to go to that school, and I can get an education, and I can get a job, and I'm going to be able to make those payments. So rather than having a blank check to go to whatever school you want to go to, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, let's think about this like any consumer decision. What's the cost? What's my benefit? And can I afford it? So directionally, I understand the problem, but I think that there's some logic behind what they're trying to do at a macro level.
You know, it's interesting when you start to think about the timeline. When is a freshman supposed to declare his or her major when they've got this earnings threshold hanging over their head, potentially?
Yeah, that's really what's interesting about that, Bob, is I'm going to say it this way: it doesn't really matter to the student, because whenever they declare, they're going to get through the school and they're going to get out and they're going to get their job. It matters to the university because they want to make sure that that median earner is getting a degree that gives them value above what the formula says, right? So what's really interesting about the point you just made is that it's causing, I think, some of the colleges to look and say, how can we get students onto a track that makes sense for them sooner? Right, and then the other part of that is this median earnings thing and what the cost, how much they have to borrow. Should we actually start reducing the price of some of these lower earning job degrees? Like we need social workers, Bob. We need tons of them, right? But the social worker's not making what the mechanical engineer is making when they're getting out of school, but they can take the same amount of debt today. And I'll just, one other thing, I'm on a little bit of a harangue here, but there's one thing that was rejected during the One Big Beautiful Bill, and that was this idea of tying loan amounts to majors, right? That was in the discussion early on, and that's really difficult to sort of monitor, but that's how the Congress was thinking about it. They said, we just want to make sure that if we're giving money to somebody to go to school, they're going to get a benefit from it.
I just can't imagine that the Congress in Washington are the people to fix this, since they built the mess to begin with. But do you see a situation where a college just says, do we really even need to offer this major? That's
happening. That's 100% right. And there was this really great article in 2003. I remember this was in Business Week. I had to go give a speech somewhere, and I didn't know what I was going to say. And I was in the airport, and there's this picture of this woman on the cap in her hand, and there was a point in the article that said the problem with college finance is that it's the difference with there's this public good and social benefit tied into the whole idea of getting a degree, which is why the traditional laws of economics don't apply to school economics, right? And it hasn't changed since 2003 because of that very point. It's something that we want everybody to benefit from, but there's real cost involved, and now we're seeing a reckoning of all of this over the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I guess it's just it's a process just to kind of see how this plays out. I mean, to be fair, it is a big mess. And
it is a big mess.
To get it to where it needs to be is going to be an interesting scenario. And you have one person. This article that I read says one person made the argument that people who have the money can still get the degrees, while those who can't rely on borrowing will not. We're making the more elitist a two-tier system, and probably won't get that far down the line, but it's. I mean, where do you see things really smoothing out to where they've got a good system up and running?
Yeah, we'll talk about that in another year or so, probably, because we have to let this smoothing go on. The reality is, for almost 10 years, the politicians were talking about free college, forgiving all the student loans. Now we've had the reckoning. We know that's not going to happen. There's a new course that's being followed, and it's going to have to play out. And there are two problems that we have right now. One is this current borrower situation with all these people who are having real trouble paying, and two is with the way the new system is going to unfold for undergraduate, particularly graduates, and see how the institutions change, and maybe the consumers on both sides, grads and undergrads, they decide we're going to start going to less expensive schools so that we can start to get a return on our investment that makes some sense.
Yeah, I keep thinking that junior colleges are going to really benefit from this somehow.
I think that's right, because they offer certificates, they offer degrees, they offer training programs now. So that could well be the answer, and it's what's been. I know that on again both sides of the aisle for the last 5 or 7 years, there's all this discussion about, let's talk about outcomes. Let's not talk about necessary degrees, but what does a student need to be successful at a job, and what's the right amount of training at the right amount of cost to get them that job, so that they can go out and not be saddled with all this debt. Everybody wants the same thing.
Well, John, great to have you on the program. MyCollegeCorner.com. We will talk to you next month.
Be well, Bob. Thank you. Bless you.
If you have a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.